Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel. I'm on the marketing team here at the UltraWellness Center. And I'd love to introduce today's two speakers. Super knowledgeable. We know you're going to walk away with so many insights and learnings. We'll start off with Dr. George Papanicolaou. Dr. George is a board certified family physician and Institute for Functional Medicine certified practitioner. He began his career in traditional family medicine, serving the Navajo Nation with the Indian Health Service. He went on to establish a practice built around whole life wellness, focusing on treating the whole person, not just the disease. And today he brings over 20 years of experience to the Ultra Wellness Center, and some of his areas of specialty include ADHD, autism, prediabetes, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, anxiety, depression, and so much more. We also have Lisa Dreher. She is a registered dietitian with a master's in nutrition and integrative health and advanced training through the Institute for Functional Medicine. She began her career working at the University of Rochester Medical Center in acute care and pediatric gastroenterology before coming to the Ultra Wellness Center, where she's been working for 10 years. Lisa also serves as a nutrition director at WeNatal, a prenatal company where she helps develop their fertility-focused supplement line. Some of Lisa's areas of specialty include autoimmune conditions, gastrointestinal disorders, metabolic syndrome, and fertility. So many kids are heading back to school and ready to learn, but also end up struggling with focus, mood swings, or even stomach issues. And oftentimes those challenges are connected in ways we don't necessarily expect. So today we're going to unpack the mind-gut connection and share insights and actionable tips on how to set kids up for success in the classroom, at home, and beyond. And as a reminder, this is a disclaimer that this webinar is for educational and informational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. The information provided does not replace any professional medical consultation, diagnosis, or treatment. Please consult with your own healthcare provider before making any changes to your health or treatment plan, as this is a discussion for the masses and not intended as medical advice for any conditions or relevant interventions discussed. And one last reminder before getting into it is that if you signed up for this webinar, you will receive a mind-gut connection guide that will be sent to your email after this webinar. So now let's get into it. Dr. George, let's start off with what is the gut-brain connection and why is it so important?
Well, Rachel, I just want to say that it's really exciting to be here, having you talk to Lisa and I. Lisa and I work together, we collaborate together, we laugh together, and so it's really exciting to be able to share our knowledge that we gleaned over the years, have worked on over the years together with our audience. So here we go. So to answer your question, first off, I grew up in the 60s where Tang and Legos, I mean, yeah, were they Legos? Those instant waffles that you could put into the oven, and also, Pop Tarts, and because I was Greek Goudalakia, so those were my foods. And I also had ADHD, which I didn't get diagnosed till after I was out of medical school, which it would have been really nice to know earlier. So this topic, particularly the gut-brain connection, is very near and dear to me. And why is it important? Well, it wasn't important 15 years ago, and it's getting even more important now. But 15 years ago, we had something happen called the Human Microbiome Project. And we learned that the gut isn't just about digestion. We learned that there's a microbiome. There's this whole environment that lives in our gut. These 100 trillion bacteria and some viruses and some parasites that contribute to our overall health. It's like another organ in our body. And we've learned over the years that it interacts with our brain. And why? Because a lot of these gut bacteria, particularly the good ones, make neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. And they also produce short chain fatty acids that nourish not only the gut, but the brain. And so they can send messages via this vagus nerve, which is a super highway from the brain to the gut, because the brain is its own nervous system. The gut, which is considered the second brain. Some people would call it the first brain because we had guts before we had the brain. And the gut has its own nervous system. And the two embryologically are connected and have very similar attributes. And so you have this connection via the vagus nerve, and the gut actually sends more information to the brain than the brain sends to the gut. So it's really important to know that vagus nerve connection. Um, so what can happen to the microbiome can have a huge impact on our brains, how we can focus, how calm we can stay, and our ability to have some resilience in our life. So when we get this imbalance called dysbiosis, it's linked to things like ADHD, anxiety, depression, and even autism spectrum disorders. So what drives the health of the gut microbiome? Well, here's the challenge. It's food. And the food challenge is that today, more than two-thirds of kids' calories in their diet come from ultra-processed foods. And these foods are unfortunately high in sugars, artificial dyes, pesticides, preservatives, and they're very low in fiber content and plant compounds that are really healthy for our gut called polyphenols. And so these things that we need are absent in two-thirds of the diets that kids are eating. So to give you a sense of a gap, just let's focus on one of those macronutrients like fiber. And Lisa's going to talk a lot about this in her talk, in her part of the talk. We actually need 25 grams of fiber, but in the foods that kids eat today, they get about 10 to 15 grams of fiber. And that was from a study that I had reviewed while I was getting ready for this. So what happens? Now there's a shortfall of fiber. We can't make short chain fatty acids. We can't feed our gut. We can't feed those healthy microbes. And so what happens then is you have this ecosystem in the gut that is not thriving because it's not getting nutrients it needs. You develop inflammation. This inflammation, plus the overgrowth of certain pathogenic bacteria, the lack of growth of some of the bacteria that help support our gut barrier, result in leaky gut. It's increased permeability of that gut barrier. And then leaky gut allows toxins and food particles and pesticides and food coloring to enter into our bodies, and our immune system does what it's supposed to do. It creates inflammation. It drives, and so we have this inflammatory response because there's good inflammation, but you get an overdrive of inflammation that will then lead to an impact on the brain. And if that inflammation goes on and those impacts go on, we can even create antibodies against self tissue, including brain tissue, that just even adds to the problem. And I'll be talking more about that later on in my talk. So we have to really consider the connection between our poor gut health, food, and the resultant impacts on the brain, mood, learning, and behavior issues. So if you take one thing away today, it's that what our kids eat every day is not just about calories. It's about shaping the ecosystems of their gut, which in turn is going to shape their brains. And so with that as a foundation, I'll turn it back to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. George. Now, Lisa, what are some of those red flags and early signs that tell you a child's gut health might actually be affecting their school performance?
I love that question. And the reason why is because of how it's phrased, because it really gets to the heart of how functional medicine creates a framework for how we as practitioners, how we think. It's a very proactive approach rather than reactive, waiting until the performance and everything or gut issues have already surfaced and you can see them and they're very obvious. But with functional medicine, we can understand how the body works. And Dr. George did a great job of explaining how there are so many interconnected systems. It's not just gut issues or poor focus, it all interconnects. And that's what we really look at. So to answer the question, some signs that gut health might be affecting a child before you even see gut issues. Number one, and if you don't take anything away other than this, it would be like frequent illnesses. Think of frequent ear infections or repeated need for antibiotics, this idea of low immunity. There will always be times during the year when kids get sick and they all come together after the summer and they're exchanging germs and everything. That's normal, but it's not normal when they constantly are getting infections that require antibiotics. So it's not just this low immunity, but then the exposure to repeated antibiotics that could further damage the gut microbiome. Something else you can kind of pay attention to is skin issues like eczema and rashes. The skin and the gut are so intricately connected, and it can signal some gut inflammation as well. And also food refusal and more of a narrowing palate. Now, kids will go through phases of liking certain things, not liking others, maybe being a little bit more picky. But if the list of foods your child is eating or willing to eat is becoming increasingly narrow, and it's really they're only accepting a very few narrow foods, this might actually be a sign of food sensitivities, which I know Dr. George and I will continue to talk about, but these are all things to keep in mind. And a couple more quick things to pay attention to would be sort of struggling with stress and anxiety more than typical. This maybe worry and just you could tell some things off and consistently, not just situationally, but it seems to be ongoing regardless of what's going on. And I'd say the last thing to look for is more of like fatigue or tiredness or changes in mood after meals or after specific foods.
Yeah, tiredness is a big one. So Dr. George, when Lisa mentions tiredness after meals or if there's mood swings that are associated with that, what's actually happening inside the body to really create those patterns?
Well, I'm just going to just start out by saying you got to think about these things. So glucose, which is blood sugar, food sensitivities, and histamine load. And then there might be a bonus surprise if I have enough time. I'll talk about something called folate receptor antibodies. So the glucose balance. If we look at what happens when kids eat, and I just talked about the fact that two-thirds of them, or two-thirds of their diet is coming from ultra-processed foods. So those foods are going to have lots of sugar in them and very little fiber. So they're going to be considered high glycemic index foods. So after you have this high sugar, fast carb meal, your blood sugar is going to spike. And studies indicate that somewhere at about 90 minutes to 3 hours later, you're going to end up with this glucose drop. And that happens because when you eat, you get an insulin surge. And as that insulin does its job in moving glucose around the body where it needs to be, then it will, over that period of 90 minutes to 3 hours, it's going to wane. But if you've had a big glycemic load, you're going to get this exaggerated drop and you'll end up being hypoglycemic. And these dips are really strongly associated with increased hunger, lower energy, irritability, exactly what parents notice as a post-meal crash. And we as adults experience the same thing if we're not careful with our diets. The brain runs on a steady supply of glucose. And when you have these big ups and downs, it translates into brain fog, distractibility, and mood swings. Everything kids experience in school. In one study that I looked at in the Journal of Appetite, when kids eat lower glycemic index breakfasts, attention and memory are better across the morning after you'd have if you'd eaten a high glycemic meal. So that means eggs and vegetable omelets and no bagel and cream cheese. And that's really important to really think about that. Also, a lot of the cereals and granolas that you eat that may seem to be listed as healthy may have more sugars than you think and are more like breakfast desserts than they are real foods. Then there is the food sensitivity issue. And I think this is a more subtle, more under-recognized problem that's probably impacting more kids. And so parents are really well attuned to the idea that you can have food allergies. And those food allergies are really, it's the classic IgE mediated immediate response to a food, like a peanut, or other foods that kids are allergic to. And those are associated with hives, wheezing, and anaphylaxis. Everybody's familiar with those. But what people aren't so familiar with are these more subtle sensitivities that are IgG mediated. So you may eat a strawberry on Friday night, and you might feel a little bit different, but then on maybe Saturday afternoon, you start having a little rash or hives, and you don't know what to connect it to. So that's a food sensitivity. So they're very subtle. So two of the major culprits are gluten and dairy. And so people know about gluten because they know about celiac disease. And when you have celiac disease, you cannot eat gluten because that's going to result in an autoimmune response that breaks down the villi of your intestines, and that's going to affect absorption of food, digestion, and your bowel habits. And so, no gluten, absolutely not. But there's other group of people that have something called non-celiac gluten sensitivity, where they're just sensitive to it. And so they can have an immune response to it. And that immune response is an inflammatory response. And that inflammatory response, particularly if you have leaky gut, can affect the brain. And when that happens, it's sort of like a dullness. It's that brain fog that people complain about. But there's another impact. It's a metabolic impact. It's how you break down gluten and dairy. So both gluten and dairy can be broken down into these things called um, reactive peptides. And these reactive peptides are called glutamorphins and casomorphins. And in susceptible kids, and they're susceptible because they have a deficiency or absence of an enzyme called dipeptidylpeptidase. And if that's absent or insufficient, then they will not be able to completely break down their glutens and their dairy, the casomorphins, and then you get these bioreactive peptides. What happens is if they also have leaky gut, which most of them going to, and in my practice at the UltraWellness Center, uh, 75% or more of the kids that come into my practice for all variety of conditions are tested for leaky gut, and they have some degree of leaky gut. So we know that that's an issue. If there's a crossover and they have the dipeptidylpeptidase issue, they're going to form these peptides. And what do they do? So these peptides can create a gut inflammation. This gut inflammation can result in a vagal inflammatory response. So the vagus has an inflammatory response that gets message to the brain, and then that creates that brain fog. Also, these glutamorphins and casomorphins can cross through the leaky gut, penetrate the blood-brain barrier, bind to opioid receptors that we have in our brain. These opioid receptors, when they're bound, can result in opiate-like effects. You can get a little euphoria, but you can also get inattention, focus, distractibility, changes in mood. So your anxiety and depression can worsen, and then behaviors can change. You can be more hyperactive, you can be more agitated. The other impact they have is that they can impact dopamine transmission as a neurotransmitter. And dopamine in the frontal cortex is very important for focus, learning, executive function. And so, in the immediate aftermath of eating dairy or gluten, kids with susceptibility may experience all of those cognitive changes I just mentioned, and I will repeat because they're important: lack of focus, distractibility, and inattention. And then the mood changes, their anxiety might get worse, depression might get worse, and the behavior might get worse. They may be more hyperactive and more irritable. So, big connection between your food and your behaviors. The final one that is in my top three is histamine. And um, so some kids can have a higher histamine load, and it's mostly going to be based on the fact that they have genetic predispositions. We call them single nucleotide polymorphisms. And at the Ultra Wellness Center, one of the tests that we do, a 3x4 nutrigenomic test that looks at more than 100 different gene variations. Love that test because it gives me an insight into how your brain is wired, how your gut is wired, and I can see what your predispositions are. So these kids may have a variation in an enzyme called DAO that breaks down histamine in the gut, and another one called HNMT, and that one breaks down histamine systemically. So if you eat high histamine foods like tomatoes, cheese, chocolate, and strawberries, and there's a whole list of them that you can download and check to see if your kid is having a reaction to them, you may have a buildup of histamine in your system. There are also, by the way, foods like citrus fruits that aren't high in histamine, but they trigger histamine release in the gut. So again, if you can't break them down, you have leaky gut, histamine travels to the brain. When histamine hits the receptors in the brain, what do you get? Brain fog, agitation, irritability, inattention, hyperactivity. So looking for high histamine foods as a possible trigger for your kids' behaviors will be really important. And Rachel, if you think I have time, I can mention something that at least a small part of our audience might be interested in called folate receptor antibodies. But I can talk about that another time if there's no time here.
Sure, yeah. Let's move on actually because you've mentioned how nutrition is so important. We all know this, but now Lisa, which food groups actually support gut-brain connection to really improve the focus, mood, energy, and overall health that we've been talking about?
Yeah, getting into the practical piece of it. And Dr. George did mention some of them, but I want to give a little bit more context and just a wider range of examples. There's actually two parts to this. So the first part is looking at the compounds within foods, such as probiotics, prebiotics, polyphenols. And then the other section to this is more of the macronutrients and how to balance those the best way possible. So the first part being foods, like I said, so probiotics, which are active live cultures, things that are going to be giving the gut the type of bacteria and cultures that it needs. So things, of course, like yogurt, even kimchi or sauerkraut and miso. There's prebiotics, which you need to be able to not just have the bacteria, but you need to feed the bacteria in order for them to thrive. So that's where prebiotic foods come in, and those are the higher fiber foods as well that Dr. George had mentioned. So actually there's a few interesting ones. So like underripe or green bananas are pretty high in these prebiotics. There's oats, there's asparagus, there's onion, there's a lot of them. And then there's polyphenols, which is probably my favorite. I've written a lot about this, but these are compounds that act sort of like antioxidants, and they're found in deeply colored plant foods. They actually have a little bit of a bitterness to them usually. So think of things like wild blueberries, blackberries, cherries, extra virgin olive oil, certain nuts and seeds, especially walnuts and pecans, and then a ton of herbs and spices are really rich in these polyphenol compounds. So that's one section. And then one question that we had come up so many from our audience members were, how do you really balance the macronutrients and why are those important? So when you're thinking macronutrients, think protein, carbohydrates, and fats, but really thinking about them in a way that's going to support the gut microbiome. You want your carbohydrates to come from unprocessed, higher fiber carbohydrates. You want those healthy anti-inflammatory fats like omega-3 fatty acids, and then high quality proteins, because the combination of those together, these all work synergistically to help to balance blood sugar and support attention and focus. I mean, I could spend a whole webinar talking just about this, but in order to take away something practical, when people come to the UltraWellness Center, whether you are a child, a teen, or an adult, you all get a individualized nutrition plan. No two people are exactly the same and will have the same needs. But for the purposes of what we're doing today, I want to at least give a practical place to start in order to help with the balance. So think of filling sort of like the plate method. It's actually a really helpful and practical tool to use, which you can use anywhere, whether you're at home, at a restaurant, at a friend's house, what have you. But trying to fill your plate, half of your plate with the high fiber, polyphenol rich, like low starch veggies that we were talking about, including broccoli, bell peppers, even some of the probiotic rich vegetables, like again, like sauerkraut, if your kids will eat them or eventually might get on board with them. And then a quarter of the plate with high quality protein, like pastured meats and poultry, omega-3 rich seafood or eggs, beans, lentils, so even a combination between animal and vegetable. And then a quarter of the plate with those high fiber, starchy carbohydrates. Think of things like quinoa, sweet potato, butternut squash, beans, fruit, and always including a little bit of high quality anti-inflammatory fat. Again, extra virgin olive oil, nuts and seeds, avocado. This really ensures that not only are they getting an excellent balance of nutrients, but the energy that they're getting is going to last. And that's what we're talking about. It's like getting them from one meal to the next without getting on these highs and lows, these crashes where then the focus and attention just goes off the rails. So
Yeah, you mentioned how important protein is for kids. As we know, it's so important for adults as well. But staying on that topic a little bit, one question that did come up a lot is around blood sugar balance and protein as well. And it sounds like protein, yes, is very important for kids. But can you also speak to it from a blood sugar balance lens as well?
Sure. Yes, this is another one where it's kind of two parts a little bit because first, blood sugar is you can make the argument that it's even more crucial for kids and teens than it is even for adults because kids and teens use up of about 50 to 60% of the body's available glucose or blood sugar when they're learning and growing. So they have such a high demand, and that's even more of the reason that we need to make sure that the carbohydrates that they're getting are high quality. So, unfortunately, so much of the diet in America is around highly processed carbs, like Dr. George was saying, sugary cereals and crackers and white breads and pasta, which just leads to that spike in the crash. That also, it not only drains focus and energy, but also disrupts the gut microbiome, and it can feed that unhealthy bacteria, lead to lower levels of serotonin, and even BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotropic factor. It's a compound that's really key for mood and learning and memory. So using the plate method can help with that. But specific to protein, it's interesting because absolutely, protein is super important. We recommend it at every meal and ideally every snack, especially first thing in the morning. It's really important not to skip breakfast because that can really throw off the rest of your day. But it is worth noting that protein needs for kids and teens are different from adults. They are much more efficient at utilizing the protein in their diet. So their needs aren't as high as ours, and they don't need this adult size portion of protein. And really getting a combination of animal and vegetable is great, but it is absolutely important. We just need to personalize it for them.
Now, Dr. George, going back to you, I know earlier you had mentioned the 3 by 4 genetic test, but let's transition more to have a deeper dive around what testing can look like. What is that role for testing that can help get down to the root cause? And are there some top tests that you'd like to highlight?
Sure. Yeah, testing is really important to us in the functional medicine world because we look at everything from a network biology perspective. Everything's connected. It's like a Swiss watch. One gear turns the other gear, that turns the other gear, that turns the other gear. And if one gear is not working, then they all can be impacted. So we're always looking for all of those connections. And we want to personalize your treatment plan. It's a very important part of functional medicine. I see many, many kids with autism and ADHD. I see one autistic kid, one ADHD kid. I've seen one autistic kid, one ADHD kid. They're all different. So we want to personalize your diet and your lifestyle by mapping bugs, barriers, and biochemistry. That's what we do. We're not looking for labels. We're looking for those things that help us find the root cause conditions for what's going on so that you can do the best you can. We can optimize your health, whether you're sick or whether you're healthy. So we map out the the gut ecosystem. So I'll talk about some tests that do that. We like to check nutrients and mitochondrial status. I'll talk about some tests that do that. We look at the gut integrity. We're looking for leaky gut. And then we want to understand the genetic wiring that shapes focus, mood, and stress responses. So it's really important. These tests leave us in a position where we're not guessing. It's always test, don't guess. So I have my favorites. The nutrigenomic is probably at the top. I love that because it gives me your predispositions. And when I'm dealing with children and adults, but we're on the top of the kids today, I want to know what some of those really impactful, deeply penetrant genetic variations are in their brains. And so I'm going to list a couple of them that we look for. And again, this test is to look at predispositions. Genes are merely blueprints your body uses to make proteins. Those proteins will be a majority of them will be enzymes. They catalyze all the reactions that make you work. And then structural proteins that help keep everything together from bones to membranes to nerves. So having said that, some of the genes I look at, one is called the COMT gene. This is responsible for breaking down dopamine. And if it's too slow or too fast, it can have an impact on your brain. And it's commonly associated, if you have one of the variations, with learning difficulties, inattention, focus, anxiety, and even depression, because it impacts dopamine clearance and can impact the frontal lobe, where you need that dopamine for executive function, learning, and focus. So if you have one of those variations, you may struggle. Another one that's also responsible for removing dopamine in the presynaptic part of the nerve synapse is MAO. Really important. And again, it will lead to an imbalance of dopamine. And if it is involved, you can have an increase in mood impulsivity when you're under stress. Then there's one that a lot of people know about. It's the MTHFR gene. Everybody's excited when they come to the UltraWellness Center to find out about their MTHFR status. And I just remind them with a little silly grin on my face that it's only one of many, many methylation genes. But it is important. It does have an impact because it impacts the folate cycle. And folate is very important to brain metabolism. And if you have that gene variation, and there are various combinations that can impact you, you may have developed, or you may notice an exacerbation of symptoms. So we look at the MTHFR. Lisa mentioned brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Brain-derived neurotrophic factor is really important in plasticity of the brain, so its ability to change based on its epigenetic or its exosome environment. And it's also very much involved in memory because it helps build new neurons, but also has some component of getting more of those neurons to connect to each other. The more connections you have, the more you can learn, the more you can focus, and the better you can have in remembering things. And it's boosted not only by food, but by exercise and sleep. So that's an important one. And then the last one we look at, and I know I'm overdoing it, but I want you to get a real sense of what we can do with genetics, is the HTR1A, and this is involved in serotonin expression. If you have this gene, the variation that may make you susceptible, it will make you susceptible to, if you have a very stressful event, post-traumatic stress disorder, and more likely to experience depression and anxiety. So really key one, really helps me when I'm working with my kids with autism and ADHD to really dial in and personalize their care. The other one that I like to do is the NutriVal. So the NutriVal looks at 125 biomarkers and organic acids. This will let us know, are you getting all the nutrients you need? Do you have the right combination of amino acids and fatty acids that are really important for brain development and function? Are you getting the minerals that you need? Do you have an increase in oxidative stress, which is really the metabolic exhaust that comes from mitochondria when they're making energy? It's an oxygen molecule. We call it oxidative stress. You have signs of that because that's very damaging to cells and can impact your overall health and brain function. And then finally, we look at some flags, some red flag markers on the NutriVal that might help us understand if you're making enough energy so you can support a good mood and maintain healthy focus. The last test I'll mention will be one that looks at both leaky gut and histamine levels. So this is a really good test that we use. It will kill two birds with one stone, and knowing if a kid has leaky gut is very important. So those are some of the tests that we use. And the bottom line when I choose tests is to answer specific questions. It's really important that your pre-test probability of what you think is going on be greater than 50%. You just don't do tests willy-nilly. You don't do a shotgun of tests. We do them because we're actually trying to answer a question. And most importantly, if we get the answer, whatever answer we get, we know what to do with it. And that's what we have many, 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 many years of experience working individually and together as a team to using these tests to know how to use them, use the results to have an impact on your health.
So we've talked a lot about genetics, nutrients, nutrient absorption. So I think it makes sense now to let's talk a little bit about supplements and where that fits into the plan for your patients. Kids are still growing, they have different needs. Do they actually need to be on a supplement protocol? And if so, what are some of those go-to top, 3 to 5 supplements that you like to turn to?
Sure. So, Lisa and I have talked about this, lots of times, and we collaborate often. And it's food first. It's always food first. And Lisa did an excellent job of just going through all of the food groups that you can include in your diet for a healthy gut, healthy brain. And I just want to refer you back to the guide that you can get after this webinar is over because it was really well done. It's chock full of great tips on how to eat well. Supplements fill gaps. So it's basically your seatbelt. It's your safety net. And so for picky eaters, for college students who are just on the run, you might want to consider supplements. I'll just start by saying there are some categories, kids and adults, that when we do those tests, when I do the NutriVal, they're commonly, I'm talking 75% of the patients that come into my practice, we're going to see their omega index is really low. We're going to see vitamin D levels in the 30 range, maybe low 40s. Your primary care will say that's normal, but we know that it's not optimal. And we like to see that range to be higher. So vitamin D is commonly one that I'll automatically want to think about. So omega-3s, vitamin D, and then magnesium. So those are the top three that I think about. As I was preparing for this webinar, I came across several studies, but there was a small randomized clinical trial that showed, and it was replicated, but it shows with ADHD symptoms that EPA rich, and that's EPA is one of the omega-3s that you find in salmons and sardines. Those are really can reduce ADHD symptoms when you're getting 4 grams or more. So omega-3s are really important. Then there's vitamin D. So low vitamin D, we're talking, 30 or less, which I see quite frequently, is associated with decreased moods. And in randomized clinical trials, lower levels of vitamin D are associated with ADHD and mood shifts in their behaviors. Magnesium supports mitochondria and ATP production. No mitochondria, no energy, no life. Mitochondria are critical. Magnesium is critical. It's involved in more than 300 reactions in the body. Some of the most important ones are in your mitochondria, and the other really important ones are in the brain, where it helps to support the calming neurotransmitters. So magnesium will be a big one. And then specifically for dopamine balance in kids with the ADHD, B complex is important because it will support methylation, particularly if it has methylated folate and B12, but B6. B6 is really important because it's required for serotonin and dopamine and GABA metabolism. And it's one that's commonly low and missing in my kids. So those are my favorites, but there's more.
That's great. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of information in the guide that everyone will get. So some of this will be in there as well. So Lisa, now once the parents and family actually have these personalized recommendations, what does support look like? How do you actually help the parents weave this into family life? Schedules are always changing. How can this actually work in the home?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I understand it can be difficult and overwhelming to hear all of this information and think you have to change everything. You don't. These changes happen gradually over time, and we oftentimes will do one change or one significant adjustment in either lifestyle or diet change rather than trying to throw everything at you and expect everything to just change overnight. So keeping in mind probably, and actually because I knew that this was going to be a question and we kept getting a lot of people asking how to practically put it into their life, We designated a huge chunk of the guide, especially toward the end, to have very practical tips, not just in general, but for very specific age groups, like those who are in elementary and middle school, those who are in high school, then those going off to college. So definitely check out the guide, but just to give one or two practical tips that you can take right away. Probably the number one thing that is the most helpful, and this is for kids, families, adults alike, that help to make this more practical and really shift things for you, planning and prepping ahead. Like, don't show up and just expect things to fall in place. Take some time, maybe on the weekend or a day or an afternoon that is open to you once a week, and get your list out, go to the store, stock the fridge, stock everything in the kitchen that you need, and then maybe do some prep. You don't have to cook and have all these meals ready to go for the rest of the week, but maybe you grill some chicken or you hard boil some eggs, you make some dips like bean dips or something. Have stuff that can come together very quickly so that when time, which is of the essence, is ready and when everybody wants to eat, you don't have to be spending hours in the kitchen. And even if you're, if you're talking about either middle school or high school, maybe getting a bento box and trying to identify those different macronutrients that we said, buy a few different foods from each category and encourage your child to be involved, empower them to make decisions and in terms of what they eat. You as the parent can come with pre-approved choices, like three or four of them, and then they can choose from there. It really gets them involved and gives them that sense of, oh, I have agency over these choices, and they're more likely to engage. So there are so many things that you can do. Again, a lot of it is in the guide, but planning and prepping ahead of time by far and away is the most important.
Thank you so much for that. Okay, I know that there was a lot of information that was thrown out there. This webinar is being recorded, but we have a few more minutes, and there were hundreds of questions that came in from the audience. So we really tried to do our best to kind of whittle it down into some of the themes that we were hearing. So we'll go ahead and answer some of them now. So, Dr. George, the first question that came up repeatedly was around antibiotics. So, how can you protect and repair the gut immune barrier after a child has been on antibiotics, had infections, or other special cases like that?
There are many stressors to the gut, and as we learned today, food is one of them. When you're eating two-thirds of your diet from ultra-processed food, that's an ongoing threat. So I know the questions about antibiotics, but I want to remind parents that, you know what? The foods you're eating your kids every day are just as dangerous to the gut as the antibiotics are. So in general, there's an approach that you apply all the time to anything going on in the gut, but particularly after antibiotic use. So most parents will know, hey, antibiotics, I read somewhere, I heard somewhere, or it was recommended to me that my child should take a probiotic. And that is true. But the damage done to the gut may be gone beyond just the destruction of some of the good bacteria, or the possibility that because you took the antibiotic, you broke down a specific category of bacteria that would lead to an overgrowth of candida. So we know that. But we have a 5R approach that we use for most of our patients to optimize their gut health. And it starts with removing. So we want to remove any of the processed foods, excess sugars, and artificial additives. So on top of the fact that your kid had the antibiotic, you should also be thinking about removing those things. And then make sure that you limit antibiotic use. That's really, and it is important. And then we like to replace with whole foods and like protein for repair, colorful plants, antioxidants, healthy fats that you get in avocados, olives, and nuts. And then we like to not re-inoculate. That's the probiotic piece. And again, Lisa did a great job of talking about some of those probiotic-rich foods like sauerkraut, which is a great home project, by the way, that you can engage your kids in. Get some cabbage, chop it up, put it in some vinegar and water, and you'll have a great sauerkraut in about 3 to 5 days. But probiotic-rich foods that Lisa already mentioned is part of how we re-inoculate. Prebiotic fibers, again, is a whole foods. Lisa did a great job. Apples, onions, asparagus. But we may use some supplements in this regard. We may use a probiotic. We may use some Saccharomyces boulardii. We may use some additional lactobacillus or bifidobacterium. Um, and that all depend on what we're working with in that kid. And then we want to repair. We want to repair that gut lining. We want to provide that environment for the bacteria that are good to grow. So we'll use things like glutamine, zinc carnosine, omega-3s, vitamin D, and of course, my favorite and Lisa's, polyphenols, hugely important to the gut. Berries, turmeric are on the list of things. Dark chocolate is something else that it could be more of a treat that's helpful there. So when you have kids specifically, and they've had an infection and they get their antibiotic, you want to reintroduce fiber more slowly, avoid overwhelming the gut. You want to monitor for those food sensitivities that we talked about because we don't want to temporarily impair the gut or keep it from healing. And then, always important, they've just had an illness. So that illness stressed them out. They may have lost some time from school, so they'll be stressed out over school. Stress is really important. We want to manage your stress because if we don't, that high cortisol level is going to be disrupted to the gut. It's going to lead to leaky gut. And if we haven't cleaned up the gut, we haven't repaired it, then all of those bad things I talked about might happen. So managing their stress is going to be important. Get them out playing and get them breathing, journaling to help regulate that gut brain immune system connection.
I love that. Yeah, that's such an important one. It's one that us adults also have to be mindful of.
Yeah. Yeah.
Lisa, okay, this is another question that came in. We did reference histamine foods earlier in the discussion, but what are some of those high histamine foods?
Yes. So with the histamines, it's interesting because the impact that it has on behavior is so unexpected when people come in and we bridge that conversation like, oh, have you ever heard of histamine intolerance before? And making that connection is just, it can be a little bit mind-blowing because it can disrupt neurotransmitter balance. It can lead to overstimulation of the nervous system if you have this histamine overload, even disrupt sleep. So it can really affect a child in many different ways. And typically what we do, unless there is testing that we've seen that shows definitively either that they have a genetic predisposition or they have low levels of the enzyme that breaks down histamine, we won't necessarily go into a strict low histamine diet, but more of paying attention to the connection between, okay, when your child eats those foods, what does that look like? Do you see a change in their behavior and their concentration in a couple of days afterwards? And so actually the biggest thing that people don't expect is that leftovers can have the most significant amount of histamine of almost all foods. So if you make chicken soup today, might be fine, but then if you have it 2 or 3 days from now, the histamine's building up. So that could make it even harder for people and for families to identify that that's a histamine issue. So we usually say if you're going to have leftovers, stick them in the freezer. That halts the histamine growth, and then thaw it out and eat it when you're ready. Then there's also preserved, aged meats and cheeses, deli meats. MSG is a huge one. But even really healthy foods like spinach and avocado, I think Dr. George mentioned, tomatoes, citrus fruits, which trigger our body's release of histamine, and chocolate. There are quite a number of them that might surprise people. So those are some of the biggest, but again, typically we say pay attention to see if you see that connection. Maybe you see some eczema outbreaks or some rashes, maybe some headaches or increased anxiety or mood swings. But those are probably the top foods to look out for. And then, as Dr. George said, there are additional lists online that you can look into.
Great, thank you. The next question is for Dr. George. Do you have any specific resources you can recommend for children with ADHD and anxiety?
Sure. First thing I want to talk about before we do, is a segue into some of those resources, is to say that our kids are under a huge amount of stress, and one of the biggest stressors that they experience comes from social media. So today, kids are saturated with screens, social media, technology. It has its benefits. It really does, and we need to use it appropriately. But constant exposure to the rapid fire images, notification trains that try to get the brain to seek quick rewards. These can fragment focus, attention spans, and heighten anxiety, lower mood. I cannot begin to tell you the uptick in kids with anxiety, depression, and OCD, particularly young women in their adolescent ages that are coming to me, that I've never seen at this level before. So there some of that might be post-COVID related, but there definitely is an uptick in that. So that leads me to, what do we need to do? We need to balance healthy screen time with doing what? The number one prescriptions I write for my kids with ADHD, anxiety, and depression is exercise and get back into nature. Get out of the house, go out and play, right? When I was a kid, I'd get on my bike after school, and my mom wouldn't see me until the sun was setting or the church bell was ringing. That was my code to go home. So kids aren't able to do that as much anymore. So it's really important to incorporate exercise into life. Structured exercises. Karate is great for kids with ADHD. Biking, swimming, running can improve attention and focus. And then during the day, teach your kids, even talk to your teachers of your children with anxiety and ADHD, to allow them to have 5-10 minute exercise breaks where they can go to the gym, or they can, go for a walk in the hallways with a hall pass. And then make it a family routine. Make sports, hiking, and playing outdoors with your kids part of your family life. Green time outside versus screen time. So for every 20 minutes you're indoors, you got to spend 20 minutes outdoors. Forest walks with the family, have parks, park play, and then grounding. Get your kids to take their shoes off and run around barefoot when it's raining, on snow, in the grass. All of those sensory experiences help ground the brain and calm the nervous system. So those are some of the back to nature mindfulness things that they can do. Mindfulness is very, very important. And developing a daily routine of meditation is really important. There are lots of different meditation apps out there for kids, and breathing apps as well. Breathing for kids can include box breathing, which is the 4x4x4x4 method. When you breathe in for 4, hold for 4, breathe out for 4, hold for 4. How many seconds is that? That's 16 seconds, right? 16 seconds. If you do that several times a day and you do that for a month, it is going to lower your blood pressure. It's going to calm you. It's going to get your nervous system to like being relaxed and stay relaxed, even in some of the more stressful situations. I call that presilience, by the way. If you meditate every day, and one of the favorite ones I like to encourage for my ADHD kids and adults, and kids love this because there's a reward system to it, is called heart math. And heart math uses heart rate variability and an app on your phone to give you feedback while you're meditating. It actually alters the electrical conduction between the heart and the brain and balances out hormones in the body. And if you do it every day, it's going to lead to what I call presilience, is that you do it long enough and all of a sudden your brain limbic system and other important networks have been balanced and they've been changed by the meditation. So things that upset you or bothered you today, in a month, in 3 months, they're not even on the radar anymore. So those are some of the things that I love to encourage. Get out, get into the green, get out, exercise, include breathing and meditation into your child's life. And then as a family, model it. You model heart math. You model playing with your kids outside and taking them for the hikes. That's going to be really important. And for kids that are creative and like to, journaling can be a really great opportunity to express emotion, get it out, put all your worries into a box, and drop it off and mail it to nowhere.
I love that. Very, very practical advice for parents and also kids. We are running up close to time, but there is one more question that I think we got in the pre-questions and also live today, and it has to do with ultra-processed foods. We've talked about it a little bit throughout today's webinar. What advice do you have of helping children transition away from the ultra-processed foods that are currently in their diet and encourage more healthy options?
I know that's a very difficult one because the ultra processed foods are designed to be addictive, and they really are. They hijack the brain, and so once they get a taste for it, they want more of it. And it's also feeding certain gut microbiome and yeast that then make them crave more. So it's really more about the focus of how do we replace, not just like remove those things, but how do we displace those foods with healthy foods that we were talking about throughout the webinar. And research consistently shows that kids need 10 to 15 exposures of a new or a different food before they start to accept it and like it. So providing small tastes of these foods consistently over a long period of time, it's not going to happen overnight, but it's that consistency that can really start to shift their palate. Don't give up is like the number one thing I say. Don't give up. If there are these foods that we're talking about and you're thinking, oh, my kid would never want to eat sauerkraut, I think Dr. George made a great point. Get them involved, do it as a family, but you might have to make a few jars and have to present it in different ways before they start to really develop a taste for it. So focus on that. While you're doing it, you can also pair those foods, the newer foods, with things that they like. So if you're trying to get them to eat a new vegetable, for example, maybe you pair that with a dressing or a seasoning or a different cooking method that you know that they've liked in the past. So combining it can be very helpful. And Dr. George just said it before, you as a family, you have to model it. You have to be there. You can't be like, oh, this tastes gross. You really have to be there engaging in that food just the way that you would want the child to be doing. So kids are more likely to accept and do what their family is doing, siblings and even peers, which makes it difficult because a lot of the peers are eating the ultra processed foods. But when you have them, when you have a little bit more control over what they're eating, being consistent with those types of modeling behavior and always just having foods that are available in home that they will see visually and that they can touch and that they can interact with that are more of these, polyphenol rich, probiotic, prebiotic rich foods, the kind of gradually increase the amount that you have in your house over time as you gradually reduce the highly processed foods. Because if you just automatically one day wipe everything out, that's going to backfire. And you also don't want to develop or encourage a development of any kind of disordered eating where they then wait until they go out of the house and overindulge in those foods. They kind of are seen as forbidden foods. So it's a balance, and we have to keep that in mind. But those would be my top recommendations to get started.
Mm.
Love that. Thank you so much. And we are right on time. We really appreciate everyone who has shown up live. Again, this is being recorded. It will be shared with you as well as the mind gut connection guide that we've been discussing. I also went ahead and dropped in a link in the chat if you are interested in becoming a patient or even just learning a little bit more about the UltraWellness Center, our methods, and our approach. There is a free 30-minute call that you can schedule with that Calendly link. And we really appreciate your time. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel. Bye, Lisa.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Thank you.